So today, the first word we're thinking about is Torah, which is there on your screen in Hebrew and in English transliteration. Torah is variously translated as teaching, instruction, most often as law. But really, I remember being at a conference where a Jewish rabbi was presenting, and he said the best way to translate Torah is the whole way of life that God requires of us as Jews, he was talking. So that's what Torah is. And Torah, law, is something that's particularly important in Matthew's gospel because, for a start, we have the passage that's here on the left from Matthew 5, where Jesus says, I have not come to abolish the law of the prophets, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. Not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So that's only in Matthew's gospel, a very distinctive and clear statement by Jesus. Why did we start with Psalm 119? It is the longest psalm in the 150 psalms that we have. It's in fact the longest chapter in the Bible. It's a psalm which praises Torah, and you would have heard that in the prayer that we were praying. I treasure your word, I delight in your statutes, I fix my eyes on your ways. So it's a psalm that praises Torah, and it's a psalm that presumably pious Jews were taught to memorize, the longest psalm of all. The way that it was taught to memorize was because it's set out as an acrostic. An acrostic is arranged alphabetically. Now, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 sections to Psalm 119. Each of those sections has 8 verses, and each of those 8 verses begins with the same letter in alphabetical order. So there you can see the red square marks the Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, the blue square, the Beit, the green square, Gimel, etc. If we were to look at it in English, I found online a translation of Psalm 119 by an American pastor, which puts it into English acrostically. So you can see how the first 8 lines start with A. It's a little bit forced when you look at it in English, but it's a method to remember the psalm. And really, all 176 verses of this psalm are saying pretty much the same thing. Lord, I love your law. I delight in your testimonies. I meditate on your precepts. I keep your ways. Now, the reason that that's important is that that's at the very heart of Jewish faith. And Jesus, of course, was born and raised and taught as a Jew. And so when Jesus affirms the law, he is simply doing what his Jewish traditions and culture do. He affirms the importance of the Torah. So we're going to look at a few other places in Matthew's gospel where this affirmation is made.
So there's a number of places where Matthew refers to the law in his gospel, and they're quite significant places. We've looked at the Sermon on the Mount before, and we have the saying there at the end that not one jot or one stroke from the law shall pass until all is fulfilled. In chapter 22, we have a lawyer asking Jesus which commandment in the law is greatest. So that's a rabbi to rabbi kind of debate question. And Jesus answers with, you shall love the Lord with all your God and all your heart and all your mind, which is the beginning of what Jews call the Shema, found in the books of Deuteronomy. And it is talking about how Jews, with all your being, with all your inward, with all your might, would be perhaps a better translation of that. And he says that's the greatest and first commandment, which you'd expect a good Jew to say, because the Shema is recited regularly every day. And then you shall love your neighbour as yourself, which is, I think, from Leviticus. And on these 2 commandments hang all the law and prophets. Now, Jesus isn't saying something unique here. This is something we also find in the teachings of Rabbi Hillel, which was who was a rabbi around the time of Jesus. So Jesus is speaking like a really good Jew here in concerning the law and how he views it and its importance and what it actually encompasses. And then in chapter 5, do not think I've come to abolish the law. I've not come to abolish, but fulfill the law. And not one stroke or letter will pass away until all is accomplished. And if you've wondered about the letter and stroke, Hebrew is generally written just as consonant letters, but you put in these little dots and strokes to make the vowels. So that is what the reference is there. And then, of course, in chapter 23, Matthew very clearly says, the scribes and Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses, therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it. So that's a very, very clear directive to say, follow the law, because that's what the Pharisees are teaching. Jesus is not impressed, however, with how the Pharisees themselves actually put into practice what they teach. And he goes on in this chapter to condemn them, saying they have neglected the weightier matters of law, such as justice and mercy and faith, in favour of smaller things, and also acting in hypocritical ways as Matthew sees it. So Torah is a really important concept in this gospel. And here we have an example of a debate that Jesus has over the law. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck the heads of grain and to eat it. And the Pharisees challenged that, saying, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. So I'm just going to ask you a question now before John and I talk about this particular passage. Who thinks the Pharisees are right? Are the Pharisees right? Are the disciples breaking the law?
Doesn't Jesus say somewhere to the Pharisees to the effect that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath?
Yes, he does, but that's not answering my question, Ian. That's Jesus deflecting the Pharisees' question, but it's not answering the one that I just asked. Are the Pharisees right? Is Jesus right?
Well, under what they were thinking and believing at the time, which was very rigid in their interpretation, they would have seen themselves as right.
Okay, who can cite the law the Pharisees are using or thinking of in this instance? Who knows it?
No.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's one of the extra things that the Pharisees have, whereas the Sadducees kept to Torah, the Pharisees added other things to it.
They did add other things to it. That's quite right, because we've got the Talmud and the Mishnah. It's not so much adding stuff to it as interpreting what's already there. They don't just pull things out of the air. But there is actually a law about this. And the disciples are plucking and rolling grain in their hands to separate the grain out of the chaff or the little casing that it's in. And that's considered harvesting. The Pharisees are right. The disciples are, in fact, breaking the law in this particular instance. I'll get John to put the passage back up again.
Elizabeth,
yes, Dean.
Is it a case that Jesus is trying to tell the Pharisees that they can't be so inflexible? The spirit of the law has to be observed, but there are going to be certain emergencies and circumstances where work must be done on the Sabbath, and their interpretation is far too rigid.
It says Christian people who've never read it. Would I be right? I'll take it from that dead silence that, you know,
So
probably
what
none
were you-
of you have
sorry,
sat there and
Elizabeth,
read
what
the
were you
law.
asking? What were you asking there?
I'm pointing out that we often pass judgment on this without actually reading it ourselves.
Yep.
If any of you have read all of Leviticus, Exodus, and Deuteronomy and Numbers, I'll take that back. But I think that is probably unlikely. So what have we got going on here? We talk about the Sabbath, the Pharisees interpreting it rigidly, but in fact, there was plenty of things in the law that did allow for things for emergencies, as Ian was saying. You have things like if your donkey falls into a bog or down a well, you can pull it out. You don't leave it to suffer all day if there's something wrong. If someone's life's in danger, you can do something to prevent that. So it's not so rigid that you watch a beast or you watch somebody die or you let some emergency pass. So what we have here, Jesus doesn't tell the Pharisees they're wrong. Is anything in this text whether Jesus is saying you are wrong?
Isn't that implied?
Well, I'm going to say it's not. What's at stake here isn't whether the law is there. It's there all right. What's at stake here is how you interpret it. Jesus' interpretation is different to the Pharisees. The Pharisees are sticking to the book, and they're saying your disciples are doing what is not lawful. Jesus does a typical rabbinic thing. Here we have Jesus entering it with the Pharisees into what we'd call a halakhic debate, which is how Jews still debate, actually, but how they were debating back in the first century. Jesus counters that with a question. He says, he doesn't say, no, you're wrong. He says, have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? So he counters with a question, and then he explains what he means. He says, David broke the law because of his great hunger. And the implication here is the disciples are breaking the law in the same way as David did because of their great hunger. And David is doing the work of God. The disciples are doing the work of God. And then he goes with another question. Have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? What he means by that is they actually do things in the Sabbath, in the temple, in the rituals that might be considered work, but that's kind of like an exemption. So Jesus is saying, one, the great King David broke the law because of his hunger, and two, there's always exemptions for rules in the circumstances that require exemptions. And he points out something greater than the temple is here. And of course, he's talking about himself. But if you had known what it means, I desire and not mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Jesus finishes his argument with a punchline from Scripture. Again, that's really typical rabbinic debating stuff. And then he concludes by saying the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. That is, I am better at interpreting this than you are. So that's how Matthew sets out this debate. John, do you want to say anything more about this?
No, that's fine.
So we can see here that Jesus isn't saying the Pharisees are wrong, because they're not. That is a law. What he's saying is his interpretation is far better than their interpretation, and he gives evidence from Scripture to back himself up.
Isn't he actually saying a bit more than just that he's better interpreter than them, to say he's the Lord of the Sabbath? Doesn't he sort of almost saying that he can make the rules because he's greater than the Sabbath?
I don't know he's saying he's greater than the Sabbath. We're interpreting Lord probably in the wrong way by saying as an overruler or oversighter. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. That is, he is why the Sabbath was there. If you think of why God created the Sabbath, it was to rest, and God made the rules around the Sabbath. So I guess in a sense he's saying that, but it's more he's saying is he is the one, because of his unique position, who understands this better. So he's saying their interpretation is wrong, but he's not saying the law is wrong.
Hmm.
Otherwise, he wouldn't bother giving this great rationale for why he's right. He gives a rationale
always
because
in the
that's
same
what you
situation now, aren't we? It's the interpretation of things we debate over.
We do. I mean, Jews do this all the time. If you talk to Jews, they'll tell you one passage, 70 interpretations. And that's why they have such a good time discussing it and looking for what might be the right interpretation. And I think probably they're onto something here. But Jesus goes into a rabbinic style of debate, and he sets out very clearly why he thinks the way he thinks. He doesn't just say, I'm the boss and this is the way it goes and you're wrong. He doesn't say that. He enters into what is a debate. We don't get the Pharisee side of it because Mark and Matthew don't report it. But it's very clear that he's setting it out along the rules of Jewish debate. And he's not saying it's wrong. Because when they say it's not lawful, he counters with a story that says you can do things that aren't lawful if the right circumstances require you to do so. So that's not saying the law is wrong. It's saying the law has exceptions.
Is it also, and I think we can be just as guilty of it, is legalism as opposed to what he says he desires mercy.
And not sacrifice.
Yeah, and when we just do the legalistic approach to our faith, we leave out mercy often.
Look, I'm going to say Matthew's Jesus is just as legalistic as the Pharisees he's arguing with, especially if you look on the Sermon on the Mount, where there's no room there at all.
And the other thing to say is when he says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, he says, if you had known what this means, he's actually quoting the prophets. And the prophets have a long thread of criticizing people for, going to church in our terms, for going to the temple, for bringing their sacrifices, but not actually showing mercy, not actually living out justice, not actually demonstrating compassion in their lives. So the prophets are constantly criticizing society on the basis of injustice, which is just as central to the law as bringing sacrifices. So he's using the law to criticize how the law is misunderstood in his view.
That's a very Jewish thing to do. That Jesus is.
But can I ask, the Matthew's audience would understand this as a rabbinic exchange style of talking.
Yes,
but
they would.
We're culturally separated, and we don't see that in general unless it's explained to us by someone like you.
Yes, that's probably right. And we have been taught through all of our Christian lives probably that Judaism was legalistic, that the Pharisees were rigid. That isn't true. If the Pharisees were that rigid about the law, we wouldn't have the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are enormous documents with different interpretations of all the different parts of Scripture. Pharisees were really good at midrash, at backstories, at all sorts of interpretations. And that's not what we've been taught. And, we've been taught poorly, I would venture to suggest. Because Judaism was a very flexible religion. For a start, they included other people, which I can't say the same, for instance, for evangelical Christianity, who wants to put only Christians in heaven and everyone else somewhere else. So Jews don't think like that. So put aside the idea that we've got a batch of legalistic teachers here. It's a pejorative word, and it's not true. I mean, Matthew gives them a bad rap, but you have to understand his context where he's having violent arguments with them about who's right about Jesus. And when you understand that context, you see this as an in-house fight between Matthew and other Jews that don't agree with him. So the rhetoric can get ramped up a bit. But as Christians, we need to stop thinking of this as something that's burdensome or legalistic as the law, because Jews just don't see it that way.
Yeah, and someone said that their professor of Hebrew said that the Torah is better expressed as the teachings rather than the law.
Yes, it is.
And another thing I heard about the Pharisees is, although in John, the question of the woman caught in adultery was a question about stoning, but in fact, that sort of reaction didn't occur anymore in first century Palestine. Anyway, I don't know if it's because they're under Roman rule, but those literalistic interpretations or legalistic ones weren't being applied by the Pharisees.
The fact that the Pharisees brings the woman to Jesus for judgment suggests that they actually don't know what to do with her.
Mm-hmm.
And that they're hoping Jesus is giving them a way out of maybe fulfilling a law that's very arbitrary and condemning. I don't think they're taking that woman in that story to Jesus to trick him. They're taking her there because they've got to a point they don't know what to do. And I think this isn't a test of Jesus. They're rather hoping he's going to come up with a solution. And he does with his clever statement when he says, "Let you who have not sinned cast the first stone." They all just leave. No one debates him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to go into groups to discuss this, or do you think we've done enough on this, Elizabeth?
I can ask the group, do you want to go and talk about this further, or do you think we've covered this?
I think we've covered this.
We've covered this, yeah. So it's important just thinking of the history of anti-Semitism, it's important how we use words like Pharisaic or legalistic. It's important we think of the language we're using and how that might impact on what is still of people in a living faith. All right.
Mm-hmm. We're going to look at dikaiosune now.
Do you want to talk about that, John?
Yeah. So dikaiosune, there in the Greek and transliterated into English, can be and is translated as justice, and can be and is translated as righteousness. Righteousness we're very familiar with because every time dikaiosune appears in Romans, and it's quite a lot, it's 20 or 30 times or something or other, it's translated as righteousness. But every so often, so not every time, because Romans 3:5 it's not, but every so often when the word appears in the New Testament, translators into English translate it as justice. And so we thought, what is the difference that is implied by these two terms? If something is just, does that have a different sense to something that is righteous? And to help think about this, what you've got on the screen in front of you is part of the famous parable of the sheep and the goats, Matthew 25. And verse 37 is the critical one. That's where dikaios appears, which is the noun form of, or shorter noun form of dikaiosune. Do you translate that as, I was a stranger and you welcomed me, I was naked, you gave me clothing, I was sick and you cared for me, I was in prison and you visited me, and the ones who are righteous will answer him? Or do you translate it as the ones who act with justice will answer him? In other words, is dikaiosune righteous or just?
And are they the same?
And are they the same? So what are the connotations of righteousness? What are the connotations of justice? And we've put them together into this term. What difference does righteous justice make for you if you hyphenate them and put them together? Anyone want to have a bite at that?
When I was thinking about it this morning, righteousness, from my perspective and my limited understanding of Hebrew would be, or Greek, it's a personal response that's to God, whereas justice is the working out of that righteousness. So it's the doing.
All right.
That's how I separated them. Righteousness is a spiritual response, and then justice is a working out of that.
Yeah, right.
So how do you think the ancient people would have heard this word or read this word? So you're a first century peasant, and Jesus is up there saying dikaiosune in your life. What are you hearing?
What's that? That is it Mike or something? It's the three things. It's to act justly. Acting justly is different from. I mean, justice for us has a sort of a judicial overtone.
Yeah.
But acting justly is different. Acting justly seems to be same as acting with righteousness. So I presume that's what the first century people might hear by that.
I mean, that's a rhetorical question, by the way. I don't know the answer to it. But when you've got these words that have these double or multiple meanings, it's interesting to think about what were the listeners of Jesus hearing when they hear this word?
So justice has connotations for us. Justice is carried out by a judge or a jury in a courtroom with laws that you either keep or break. And it's a determination of whether you've broken the law. And if you've broken the law, there are punishments. So justice has got all of that forensic legal baggage associated with it, at least in my mind. Whereas righteousness can be used in a pejorative sense. If someone is so righteous, they are self-righteous, they can't help but showing their righteousness, how wonderfully good they are to everyone. So righteousness does have that kind of personal sense, whereas justice has the way that society is structured. That might be one.
John, it only has that connotation if you prefix it with self.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
If you're using the word righteous on its own, it's got connotations of the highest ethical standards of living out a personal, impeccable morality, and whereas justice, as you explain, it's got that justice system connotation, but we also, if we call somebody just, we mean that they're fair, they're even-handed.
We also talk about in the Christian church, and we talk about this term a lot, and it's social justice. And I rather suspect social justice is probably encompassing and closer to what the meaning of this word is back in the first century. And Matthew, of course, in that passage actually spells out what dikaiosune means. It means to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, visit the sick, etc., etc. They're all things the church would refer to as social justice. And there may be things that you would expect a righteous person to do. So John and I like the term righteous justice because that to us seems to pick up the concept of dikaiosune as it was probably intended, where you can't separate your righteous attitudes and thinking and from your behaviour as a righteous and just person.
Elizabeth, that word
dikaiosune.
Is that the origin of our word deacon, or is that?
No. Kind of.
No.
John could probably explain that better. It sort of is, but
no, it's not. Diaconia.
No.
Diaconia.
It's a different word. Yeah.
It's got the same letters, but in different combinations.
It's related to the Hebrew, Ian. The Hebrew word zedekah is direct. That's the direct foundation, or exactly the same as the Greek word dikaiosune. It too means just or righteous justice. So it's more related to that, even though it doesn't look the same.
All right. Lawlessness.
Okay.
So law's the positive side, lawlessness is the negative side.
Just to explain a little bit about Greek, Greek is an inflected language and it has prefixes and suffixes to explain things like opposites, and it just adds to the word. So the Greek word nomia is law, and if you stick an A in front of it, it becomes lawless or unlaw or not law. It's similar in English to ready, unready, for example. So it indicates an opposite. So Matthew uses this word, anomia or anomias, depending on whether it's plural or whether it's what gender it is. It's the word for law with an A stuck in front, which means it's the opposite of law. So we find it in a number of places. Matthew 23:27, where Matthew's having a good dig at the Pharisees, he uses it there. He says, you are full of hypocrisy and anomias, that is lawlessness. In chapter 24, which is a chapter with all these apocalyptic predictions by Jesus about, you know, the moon going dark and the sun falling from the heavens and earthquakes and all these portents of the impending day of the Lord. Part of that, he also talks about nomia or anomia, and because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold, but the one endures to the end will be saved. Now, in your Bible translation, some of them may translate it as lawless. They're much more likely to translate it as things like evil or wicked or sinful. But that's not actually what Matthew is saying, because he's very clearly saying it's the opposite of keeping the law is being lawless.
Elizabeth, it's just interesting to note here that that word anomia is a word that the sociologists use to describe general directionlessness in society. It was one that was used by the great French sociology Durkheim, who was trying to explain the increase in suicide rates, and he attributed that to the breakdown of social norms in society, the loss of religion, and if people don't have a religion, they lack direction, and in that condition of directionlessness, that's when suicide rates go up. People feel hopeless, and they respond to that by suiciding. Now, that was the word that he chose, anomie, and it's one that sociologists still use.
Yeah.
Directly derived from the Greek,
Yes, and there's some sense about that. If people just, you know, it's like judges, where the people did what they pleased, and it ends up with this chaos and hopelessness. All right. So we've got.
Can I just ask about some background to Matthew? This is because it's of the Greek. Is it thought he was writing to Hellenistic Jewish diaspora because it's in Greek, or what?
I think Matthew is writing in the common language of the empire, which is Koine Greek. That's which says to us he's an educated person. He may well be a scribe, knowing Greek. And it's a time when a lot of Jews were forgetting Hebrew, and they were writing their Old Testament was written in Koine Greek. So I think it is a reflective of that time of the empire that Matthew chooses to write in this rather than Aramaic. And I guess it depends on where he's writing. There's a tradition that says he's writing in, I think it's
Syria.
Antioch,
Syria.
Yeah. And we have no actual evidence for that. I would say if Matthew's writing anyway, it's probably the north of Israel, because he seems to be rather focused around Galilee.
But what we do have, what we do have is evidence that Jews were writing in Greek from 3 centuries before the time of Jesus, and they were Jews that were living in diaspora. Sorry,
you've got the Septuagint, and a lot of quotes actually are from the Septuagint rather than from the Hebrew.
Yeah. We've got the Septuagint, and we've got historians, and we've got Jewish kind of philosophers, and we've got Jewish poetry in Greek, and we've got Philo in Greek and Josephus in the late 1st century, and we've also got evidence from the within Jerusalem itself, the Greek was used. In fact, the name of some of the high priests who were obviously Jews of Levitical lineage, their names were Greek. So there were Jews in Jerusalem that were adopting Greek names. Yes.
It's the common language of the Roman Empire, and it means that, I mean, you can keep going with Aramaic, I suppose, or try and do that, or you can pick up Latin, which you don't want to do because that's the language of the hated conquerors. So I guess, you know, living in a Hellenistic world, people picked up Greek, which seemed to be more commonly known across quite a number of countries, and they began to operate in that because living in the Roman Empire, that just made sense. They were living in these communities that didn't speak Aramaic, even if they were capable of speaking it themselves.
Yeah, because it's interesting because different languages give rise to different ways of thinking, don't I? Think
they do.
That would be correct.
Yeah,
yes.
I think that's right, John.
Yeah.
They do. And language will influence how you see culture and how you actually express that. Yeah.
Before we go on, could I just ask, in chapter 24, that last bit of a slide, what is the love of many will grow cold? What is he talking about there? Is it the love of people, or is it the individual love?
I don't think it's individual love he's talking about here. I think it's probably a bit of a swipe at followers. It could have a double meaning. One is that many will drop away because there's an increase in lawlessness, and there's all these things that, like false prophets, leading people astray, and people will be led astray. And the love, that is their love of God and their commitment to that, will kind of fade away. Or it could be a generalist comment with saying that when all of these things happen, people will become very selfish, and they'll become very self-centered rather than more community-minded, because this is a very community-minded gospel, because most of the Old Testament is community-minded. When we talk about praying to God, it's always communal. It isn't individual. I mean, Jesus does it, but Jesus is a bit of an exception to the rule when he does that. And we can probably pick that up in a later study. But it's about community. So you can probably see this as having multiple meanings.
Yeah, thank you.
So do you want to say something about translation before we go into the question?
I think I did say something about translation, is you'll often find this not translated as lawless. It'll be translated as lots of different things. Our translators change this word. And by doing so, I'm going to put to you, they're actually changing the way what Jesus is actually saying, because they're removing references to law or not doing law. So we want you to talk about this in your groups. Why do you think translators do this when they come to looking at these passages? Yes, I don't think it's not so much it's elusive. It's all right to call the Pharisees lawless, but if we're talking generally, we want to use a more generic term. I think that's the thinking of the translators, Bill.
Okay. Yep.
Because if we pin it down and talk about people who do the law and people who don't do the law, as Gentile Christians, we are not doing the law. So let's call it evildoers or sinful people or the wicked or something like that. Because if we start saying it's those without law or those who don't follow law, that creates a bit of an existential dilemma for us. Anyway, that's what I think. That's what I assume they're doing.
I agree with you, Elizabeth.
Yeah. Wow. Any other comments? I mean, you may not end up with as much love for Matthew as you started with by the end of this course.
All right. Well, let's go on to an easier section then. The antitheses. We're going back to the Sermon on the Mount now, back to a part that we skipped over when we looked at the Sermon on the Mount. After Jesus says, I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill the law and the prophets, he then gives a masterclass of interpretation of 6 examples from the law. And these are traditionally called the antitheses because of the way that they are structured. It's very formulaic, and this makes it quite easy to get a grasp on what Jesus is doing. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, but I say to you. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. 6 times we have this antithesis. So what Jesus does is quote something from Torah. You can find all of these in the books of Exodus or Deuteronomy or Leviticus if you go searching. A concordance would be your friend to do that. You can find all of these, and then you can read and hear what Jesus says, what he says to you. Now, he doesn't say, toss it out. We don't need laws about murder. We don't need laws about revenge. He doesn't toss it out. He says, I say to you, if you are angry, not if you are murderous, but if you are angry, even if you're not acting on the intent, not committing adultery, but looking with lust is bad enough. So in my mind, what Jesus is doing here is then there's not antitheses. He's not setting himself up in opposition to the law. I think these actually are more likely as intensifiers. You've heard this is the law, but my take on it is this, which is far more intense and confronting and demanding even than the law is. So this blows apart the notion that the Pharisees were legalistic, because Jesus is, if you want to use that term, Jesus is even more legalistic. He's even more focused on the law. What is it that drives the law about murder? It's respect for the other person. And how do we show respect for the other person? Well, we don't kill them, but we don't even get angry at them. We try and work things out with them. So Jesus here is becoming quite hyperbolic. I think this is part of the Jewish way of operating. It's certainly part of Jesus' way of operating, that you exaggerate. You know, whoever does not love his mother or father cannot be my follower. Or in another version, whoever does not even hate mother and father cannot be my follower. That's beyond the pale, isn't it? So,
John, is this an example of the righteousness exceeding the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees?
Probably.
I think so, yes, because that comes immediately before. So yes, Jesus is saying, I'm fulfilling the law and the prophets. I'm adopting righteousness, and I want you to know that your righteousness, our righteousness, needs to be even more intensified. It needs to exceed. Yeah, that's right.
And could I just ask about the meaning of the word fulfill? Because a lot of people just take it as, obeying literally, and I thought it meant more than that.
Yeah, my take on the word fulfill when it's used is, if you think of pouring liquid into a cup, it's filling up to overflowing so that it flows over and down the edges, so that you've got more than an abundance of whatever it is that you're fulfilling. Yeah, and that's what he's doing here. He's really intensifying things.
Tom, if I can certainly appreciate that the intensification process that we can see here, but it's also extending the meaning of the law, isn't it? It is an extension. The law is not something that's narrow.
Yeah.
the law as something that can be extended.
Yeah. Well, to go back to what I gave as the rabbinic interpretation or translation of Torah, law is about a whole way of life. It's not just about keeping on the right side of the road. It's about the whole ethos of how you drive and how you relate to other people when you're in this speeding machine. For instance, for us. So yeah, so yes, it's a much broader thing than just the kind of black letter law. That's what the
is Jesus saying something like this? Look, it's not sufficient just to abide by the law, because if you don't, you'll be afraid of being punished. You must internalize the law. It must become a part of you, and you must obey the law because you have a deep spiritual need to do that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I talk about here, we talk about here Jesus going to the heart of the matter. Internalizing it is a good way to think about it. And in fact, I think in 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at Matthew 15, where that's precisely the issue about how you adhere to the law, like by what is inside, not what is on the outside. Elizabeth and I have had interesting discussions with Jewish people when we've been part of in past years, we were part of the Jewish Uniting Church dialogue with the Jewish community. And one take on Jews is that they're very ritualistic, that they do these things regularly, and that, we have the same kind of thing in Christian church. People look at Catholics, Protestants look at Catholics and Anglicans and say, oh, it's so ritualistic. You say the same words every week. You use the same prayer book. You, in fact, know the prayer book off by heart. You don't even have to use it. Where is the heart in that? Well, the Jewish take on it from our Jewish friends was that you do these things, you do them regularly, you do them every day. They become second nature. What they are doing, you can just do it, and you can think then as you're doing about what you're doing and why you're doing, and you can reflect on God and why God has given us this law, so that the ritual actually becomes the pathway into the internalization, which is a deepening kind of spiritual connection with God through the law, through the way of life that you lead. I don't know, do you want to say anything more about that?
I think that a simpler way or another way of looking at it is that the law isn't about being a legalistic burden of all these rules that you must carry out or God will smite you. The law is it's a number of things. It's about how you worship God in the temple. It's about the welfare system of the Jewish people. How do you care for the poor? How do you care for the alien, the widow, and people who are doing it tough in your society? But the last thing that does is the law makes sacred your everyday life. So inserting the law into things about what you eat and what you wear and the animals you keep and how you look after them and how you treat each other means that everything you do becomes a sacred act, and it becomes, if you like, some sort of offering to God. And I think that's something we actually lack in Christianity. We don't have these things that turn our everyday acts, like washing the dishes or mopping the floor or just being nice to a neighbour. They're not necessarily sacred acts in the way the law makes these acts sacred in Judaism. So that's really part of its intent. How do you live in a way where all of your life becomes an offering to God, and every act you do is part of that offering and is sacred?
Is that what might be like when the prophets spoke about the law written on people's hearts? The way of saying it's not just about the words, but it's about how you live, and it's embedded deeply in your life.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think Jews are onto something with that. So if you have these little rituals like the Sabbath where you light candles and you say blessings before your meal or during your meal, it reminds you the whole time that you are a child of God and you do this as an act of worship, the closest we would have in our everyday life is probably saying grace before meals. In the Christian community, we tend not to have these little domestic rituals and things that the Jews have.
So can we go back into groups?
Yep.
And ponder this? Jesus insists we must go beyond what the law says. He penetrates to the heart of the matter, invites us to write the law on our heart. He invites us to make spiritual connection through the law, all of these words we've been using. Is it possible for us to obey these commands that Jesus gives us? Why or why not? I'm thinking specifically about the 6 antitheses.
How did you go with this question?
In our group, we tend to talk about it through personal examples, of personal experiences. For example, accepting others, we mentioned the fact that at TUC we have quite a few rainbow people. The reason we have quite a few rainbow people is that they know they're not being judged when they come to join our congregation.
Yeah.
They are just accepted, if you like the straight people who are there because they're sinners and are seeking redemption. That's what the rainbow people are doing. They're seeking compassion, they're seeking acceptance, and they're seeking redemption, just like the rest of us.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. So, the heart of the matter is, what do we really stand for? Is it love, compassion, and acceptance, for example, just to paraphrase what you've said, Ian?
And I in that context, I really appreciate John's emphasis on intensification. It's the law isn't something you do because it's the law. The law is something you do because you've internalized it and you seek to apply it everywhere you go. And I like what you said earlier, Elizabeth, about Jewish people finding fulfillment in doing it. It's in fulfilling the law, it almost becomes an act of worship in itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. Any other comments?
Well, I think we still give ourselves a lot of exceptions to the rule in the way we live.
Yep.
Give ourselves a free pass to harbour some hurtful thoughts from time to time, or like all those things which, as Ian says, are where we haven't sort of lived this more intense and deeper understanding of the law. So I think we do our best, but I think we need to be honest and say, well, when we front up to church and have our prayers of confession, then we should be taking that to heart.
Elizabeth, can I just say something from my Tongan perspective?
Yeah, sure, Otto.
I've been forced myself to listen and move being a Tongan and a Tongan Australians. Part of the struggle, worship for us, we always identify with church, a church building. How can we make a dancing in a 21st birthday celebration as a sacred act of worship in a secular hall, not a church building? It's part of the struggle for me when I move back to our Tongan community. I go with that understanding that regardless of my minister's identity, but as a Christian, whatever I do, whether it be listening, whether it be chatting with someone around the cover pole, is an act of worship.
Yeah.
And worship is not necessarily tied down to a church building.
No.
That's right, Otto. That's bang on the money, I think. And if we try and cultivate that attitude, we'll probably do better at actually, thinking more intentionally of what we might be thinking or saying or doing in regard to others, and doing a little bit better if we keep it before it. But most people will tell you that the church isn't the church building, but you try and take their buildings off them, and you'll find they'll respond in very, very strenuous ways saying, don't touch our building, which kind of give lies to that myth that we think the church is the people. Of course it's the people, but, we get a bit attached to things like structures and buildings and rules written and unwritten. Some may be good and some maybe not so good.
Yeah. And the other question that I often internalize when I move back to my Tongan community, what makes this gathering an act of worship? What makes this gathering an act of worship? Yeah.
They're good questions to ask before you go ahead with some activities. So thanks for that, Otto. Anyone else have any comments?
Well, no, that just reminds me of this. I can't remember one of the letters about saying true worship is this helping widows and orphans in distress.
Well, Matthew would probably agree.
Worship's got to be practical.
Well, that's James. Yeah.
James, is it?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm very much a James liker.
James 1:27. Yeah.
Well, James and Matthew have an awful lot in common when you put them side by side. So yes, I like the letter of James too. So we're going to move to the last part of our study today, and that's discipline within the community. And this is important because Matthew is taking on board something that Otto and Ian were saying. It's about how you are in the community. It's not just about you as an individual. So here we have what John has described here as this fearsomely intensified Jesus, speaking in dramatic and vivid terms that might be difficult for us to take on board. So Matthew is reinterpreting his tradition, if you like. Israel failed to respond to Jesus the Messiah, so Matthew's come up with his way of interpreting the law and how this new group are heirs to the covenant of God. And sometimes we call this remnant theology, and you get it a lot in the prophets, and you get it here in Matthew, and it's also in the Gospel of John, where there's a small group of people that see they have the true teachings. They're the true Israel and the ones who have the true teachings of Israel. So Matthew sets up a community rule about how people, if they're not displaying these sorts of dikaiosune, that justice or righteousness, if they're not doing the kind of things that you would expect them to do as a faithful member of a community that worships Jesus as the Messiah, then Matthew has a rule about how you're going to deal with such people. So he's got this, as well as a stringent set of moral requirements, where Matthew's Jesus says your righteousness must be greater than that of the Pharisees, and the rather graphic and exaggerated claim that if your hand or foot sins you, cut them off and throw them away, which I'm not suggesting he suggests that literally. It's hyperbolic kind of language. We have this strong internal discipline in our community with Matthew. So if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out what the problem is when the two of you are alone. So don't suffer in silence. It's not about just turning the other cheek constantly. If the member listens to you, well, great. You're both there and you're both still members. But if he doesn't listen to you, take one or two others along with you. So there's witnesses and talk it out. And then if the member still refuses to listen, then go to the ecclesia. I don't like the translation church. It's the Greek word ecclesia, and I believe Matthew is using it in the sense the Greek Old Testament use it as a community or assembly. So if the community a member won't even listen to the community, then that person will be like a Gentile and a tax collector to you. That is, they will be put out of the community if they're not following the right kind of rules. So we've got a bit of a manual of discipline there, and John's probably going to say a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls and their manual of discipline at this point.
Yeah. So the hypothesis is that the documents were found in the middle of the 20th century in the caves beside the Dead Sea reflect a community, probably a community of Essenes, certainly a community of fervent Jews that had gone some 150 years before, had gone out into the wilderness and built their own community. And those documents that were hidden in the caves were probably hidden there when the community was destroyed by the Romans. And they reflect a very rich religious life in the community of these intense Jews. So this is another group of Jews that have intensified the law, and they've really applied it to their own community. And there are psalms and songs and biblical interpretation books. And there are also documents as to how the community itself is to function. And one of those is called the Manual of Discipline. And it sets out very clearly how people are to behave in that community, what the punishments are if you commit a misdemeanor or a crime, and people could be banished from the community out into the desert by themselves. And it also sets out the fact that they took very seriously holiness and purity. They built the community with baths for them to wash in, to bathe in before they went to community meals, etc. So there's a whole set of evidence in that part of the Dead Sea Scrolls about Jews that take things really, really intensely seriously and live in community, like a commune, like a sect, like a cult even. So maybe Matthew's Jesus is reflecting something of that intensification and focus in providing this kind of guideline to the community. And of course, the other thing that's in this chapter that we haven't touched on here is the command to forgive. Forgive not just 3 times or 7 times, but 70 times 7, which is really intense. Yeah. Anyway, that's a little bit of a comparison there.
And you'll note that this particular community rule ends with verses 18 to 20, where it says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. These terms, loosing and binding, are rabbinic terms. And basically it just means that you are reflecting the practices in heaven. However you carry out what is required, and binding and loosing are interpreted sort of metaphorically here. So whatever you do, basically, in this community should reflect what is happening in heaven. And if you agree on earth, it will be done on you by my Father in heaven. And then we have this reference back to Emmanuel, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among you. That is God with us, which is Jesus' second name at the beginning of Matthew. So there's a strong emphasis here is that when you follow these rules in this community and you live this way, you are following the rules of heaven itself. And when you gather, I am there among you, that kind of jumps over the earthly Jesus to the post-resurrection Jesus in a way. We don't really have time to go into groups and talk about this, but you might have some observations or questions that you'd like to share or ask.
I've got certainly something, because I've looked at this for a while, and it's comes within a discourse which I've understood to be how to be a caring community, or a discourse on parochial on pastoral care within the community, because this section is sandwiched within the sheep that's gone astray. It's called lost, but it's actually gone astray. It's a bit different from how Luke has it. And God doesn't want to lose, or Jesus doesn't want to lose any of the little ones, which is what he calls his people. And then we have this sandwiched in the middle, this statement about some sort of three-step procedure. And then immediately after that, we have how many times should we forgive? And that's followed by a very extreme parable of what we do if we don't forgive. And this is a whole discourse, and all the 5 discourses, sort of the Mosaic, one of the Mosaic 5 discourses, they all end with after Jesus had finished saying these things. So they're areas which are easily identified as being discourses. And I don't think that, I mean, my whole problem has been with churches that just want to excommunicate and just want to tell people that they're wrong, but they don't want to do the pastoral care bit, which is what it's all about, this chapter.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Yep. That's
right. And we haven't mentioned the judgment that Matthew inevitably ends these parables with.
We'll get to judgment later on.
Yes, that's right.
We didn't want to scare you all off right from the start.
Oh, Matthew and judgment. It is scary. Yeah, but you're right. It is, John. It is setting out these discourses. It is setting out. And as a church, we're not good at doing this. Either we ignore stuff because we want to be nice and kind, and we say, oh, they meant well, we'll put up with it. Churches routinely put up with bullies and people not doing the right thing because they've been members for years, and they say, that's just old so-and-so. And old so-and-so may be way out of line, but we don't want to pull old so-and-so into line because that's the way they've always been. Or they can go to the other extreme, and especially in our more conservative churches, and say, well, you did this, out in your ear. We're not going to forgive you for this.
But
I'm a bit critical of the lectionary, and I sort of say the lectionary gives us gobbets of information, but it doesn't give us the context in which they're in.
No,
and that's the preacher's job, John.
You know, don't have the lectionary saying, this is what Matthew's all about. This is his whole theme. This is how he goes. This is how he progresses along. And the same with the others. They say, oh, here's a bit of Matthew, and you can join it with something else. And here's a little bit which is important. And I think the lectionary is actually very misleading in its approach in a lot of ways, unless there's someone there to explain it.
Well, I think that's what ministers are for, and that's what preachers are for, that you do due diligence about your passage and your context, and look at what where it sits and what it means and what might be the context of the gospel or the letter or the book in which it's sitting. I mean, that's part of a preacher's role to do that kind of work. I mean, you can't be reading entire chapters. Well, I mean, to be fair to the lectionary, you can't have entire chapters of 4 books every week to be read out in church because that's just as bad in the sense because there'd be no time for a sermon or no way of exegeting that to explain it.
Put alongside that the Jewish lectionary, in Jewish synagogues even today, the whole of the first 5 books of Moses are read in the course of 1 year. So you see what a chunk that is. And every word of that is read. That means that some Saturdays, in their case, or Friday evenings, you're hearing, 60 or 70 verses, and then the rabbi gets to expound on it. So there is that alternative. And in some more biblically focused, I suppose, conservative churches, they do this continuous preaching. They don't follow the lectionary. They say, we're going to preach through Matthew, and we're going to take a year to preach through Matthew and read the passages and look at them in context. So that's an alternative way of doing it.
Yeah.
Well, I really like that. We do
called the narrative lectionary, but and I've seen a little bit of that, and that's got some virtue in doing that as opposed to the traditional lectionary.
The lectionary is just a tool. It's up to you with what you do with it as a preacher. And I would venture to suggest to everyone here, nothing is stopping you reading the whole chapter in which that passage of the lectionary occurs, and getting yourself a good Bible study dictionary, study Bible, and you know, a biblical dictionary, or looking it up on the internet in a reputable site to have a look what it means. We can all do this. Carolyn, you wanted to say something?
I've lived a lot of my life in quite conservative evangelical churches, and it always has bothered me that the bit about the offender, it often in the church becomes a public thing, and it's often around sexual issues.
Yeah.
Very rarely if someone stood up the front and apologised for beating his wife or children, or for just being incredibly greedy.
Or slandering their neighbour.
Yes, it's very much around the sexual, and that has concerned me because I think it's a bit of voyeurism.
Yeah, and I think evangelical churches are way too hung up on sexuality because they seem to have their heads in it constantly, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, well, they lose the other bits by focusing, but that's been my experience, that I've had several people in churches I've been in that have stood up and apologised for certain behaviours, but it's all sexual. Yeah. And I just think, I'm not sure that this is really what this is about.
No, it goes well beyond that. It's about how you live. It's how you speak of other people. It's what actions you do to others. It's your commitment to those who are less fortunate than yourself. It's your commitment to make your life an act of worship out of your faith. So it's way beyond just sexual misdemeanors or even sexual sins. So, and when we look at sexuality, the Bible probably devotes, 24 verses to it. If you look at poverty, the Bible has hundreds and hundreds of verses about it and what we're to do about it. So,
I've sidetracked it, but that's
all right.
I like that process, but what I've always struggled with is the end bit. If the offender refuses to listen or wants to stand up and apologise, it's not really about what I see as heart issues. It's about external behaviour.
I guess it just depends on what it is. I mean, Matthew doesn't specify what the sin is. But if this is a time when the community is far more important than the individual. If someone is determined to be at odds with the community, they're probably told to go and find another community.
Yep. Yes.
Yep.
Not to do harm within that community.
That's right. So, we have people that sometimes come to Tuggeranong who are not, they're anti-rainbow people. And my attitude is we're not going to do everything to hang on to these people and get rid of our rainbow folk who have found safe harbour with us. Our attitude is there's 500 other churches out that door within 50 kilometres that you can attend that agree with you.
Yep.
So you are free to attend one of those, but this church is a safe haven for rainbow people.
Which is what Jesus has asked us to be as a community, not the building, but the community. Anyway, sorry, I've sidetracked you.
That's all right.
I grew up in the Brethren, and I came from an evangelical background, and of course, the big focus there is on people sinning, and they need to be saved from their sins, often because they don't want. The gospel is the gospel can free you from your sin, and then you won't go to hell. And that's sort of the summary of some of the evangelical approach.
Yep.
And so the focus is more on sins and not sinning than other churches. Not so much about doing the right thing.
I think a focus on growing a healthy, vibrant church that is active in their faith and wants to share that and has joy in sharing that and being that goes a lot further than telling everyone they're sinners.
Yeah.
All right, that's why I'm not with that anymore.
Yeah. and focus on those positive things rather than things that would condemn people, probably rather unfairly, because as Bill says, we've all fallen short, but we all do our best.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, we've come to the end of our study this morning. I think we've had a very lively discussion of the issues here, so thank you for attending. And next week, we're looking at the parables of the kingdom, and a lot of these parables are unique to Matthew or have been given a unique twist by Matthew from the Gospel of Mark. So I hope you'll join us to discover what Matthew has to say. Probably just forewarning, if you want to read chapter 13, you'll find that Matthew is rather preoccupied with hell and judgment and a number of them, but we can talk about that and what that might mean next week.